She did not hear the story, as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once, with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her.
All right, so part one of the story, very simple. You just read it. Miss Mallard hears that her husband Brentley was killed in a train wreck. Her sister Josephine is there. By the way, we should point out at level 1, this is huge, that Miss Mallard has a heart condition. She has a bad heart, weak heart. Okay? And so they're kind of wanting to be careful because they don't want to upset her too much to tell her your husband got jacked by this train wreck and he's dead. You're not going to have your husband anymore. What is her immediate response? She cries, which you would probably expect. She cries, right, in her sister's arm. Then she goes upstairs to her room alone, part 2 of the story. And we want to pay now close attention to the ways in which, in the second part of the story, a certain kind of understanding starts to arrive. Take a look.
There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring light. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought.
Now, as part 2 opens here, you've got a situation where she sits back in a chair, she looks out a window, she's looking at the blue sky, she's looking at the top of the trees, and now she's going to start to think, what does it mean that my husband is dead? Her thinking will lead her to a most remarkable insight. Let's follow it closely.
There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her 2 white, slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free. 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 The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body.
Okay, so we want to pause for a moment and write it down. So she goes up to her room, she sits alone, she looks out the window, she sees the blue sky, she sees the top of the trees. She has this kind of weird feeling that something is about to occur to her in her mind, but she doesn't know what it is. And then all of a sudden she says the same word 3 times. This will be a pivotal moment in the story. She says it out loud. What does she say? The word is what? Free. She says it 3 times. Free, free, free. As if somehow she hasn't been. Right? We are with you now at the top of page 631. Follow the words closely. You are watching genius in this story work, okay? Chopin's able to say so much without saying it. Watch the words of the story now as Mrs. Mallard begins to realize what it means that she does not have to live with her husband anymore.
She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe that have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet, she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in face of this possession of self-assertion which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free. Body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door.
Okay, so second part of story, very simple. If first part of story is she learns her husband is Jack. Second part of story, very simple, is after she's sad about it, she comes to realize she doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have to live for anybody but herself. She is free, body and soul, free. Third part of story. Now we're ready for the end of the story, and let the irony begin. Watch this.
I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I am not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richards stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the
Top of
door
page
with a
632.
latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard.
Her husband.
A little travel stain, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of accident, and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, and Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. But Richard's was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills.
Okay, so let's just finish at level 1 now. 3 parts to a simple, very simple story. Hard to imagine this story would create the kind of outrage that it created. Why? Well, obviously I have to talk about it, but let's make sure we got the story down, right? At level 1. 1, she's told her husband died in a terrible train wreck. She's sad. 2, she goes to her room where she sits all alone, and then all of a sudden it starts to dawn on her. Wait a minute. If my husband is dead, I can live free. I don't have to be accountable to him anymore. Part 3 of the story. Her sister Josephine is very worried for her because she does have a weak heart and all. But when she comes out of her bedroom, she isn't all sad and crying and all that kind of stuff, but rather she's kind of like, yes, a goddess of victory, we're told. And then as she's at the top of the stairs, she looks down, and coming through the door is her husband. Josephine, her sister's husband. Richard tries to step in the way because they don't want the shock to be too great. But the husband wasn't anywhere near the accident at all. What happens to her when Mrs. Mallard sees that her husband is alive? Falls down dead. The assumption, of course, and this is where this story gets very, very dark, doesn't it? The assumption is the reason she died was because she was so happy to see her husband had not died. And her heart wasn't very strong, and so she's like, yay, my husband is alive. Crank. The only one that really knows what truly killed her is you, the reader. Why does she fall over dead? Some students have said she dies of a broken heart. I'd write that down. She dies of a broken heart. A broken heart? Why would she die of a broken heart if her husband is still alive? Her husband didn't die. She should be happy about that. He, of course, assumes that's why she died. He will live the rest of his life assuming that his wife died because she was so happy to see him that her heart couldn't handle it. Notice the final words of the story, the joy that kills. But close readers of this story pointed out from the very beginning, no, there's something else going on in this story. Something that we'll have to chat about here in a few moments. Come back in a second, we'll continue our discussion. Thank you.